All right, this is a follow-up from a previous discussion about young Earth creationism and science and how it's interpreted in Genesis, evolution, Big Bang. If you want to see that discussion, the link is in the description. This one is going to be much more focused on the interpretation of Genesis. So if you're interested in that, it's obviously Christian content. So if that's not for you, this video is probably not for you. I'm here with the Ark Ministry. I'll also have some of his content linked in the description as well.
Hi, I'm Kevin from the Ark Ministry. I started this ministry roughly about 3 months ago. And what we're going to be doing with it is teaching some creation science, Christian apologetics. There'll be some seminars and stuff going on in there. Be a small coffee shop and little bit of a flood, kind of like a flood museum. It's not really big. It's 1/9 scale. Here's a picture of it here. Might be hard to see, but that's the Ark. It's 1/9 scale. It's roughly 60 feet long, 9 foot wide, and for that scale, the outside looks like it's 6 foot high, but it's actually 8 foot inside. Obviously to walk in. So before I get started on Genesis 1, give me a second here to get in. There's just a quick slide I put together just to do some explanations here. Okay, there's different translations of the Bible. I use King James Bible, and if we have time, I'll tell you why I actually use the King James Bible. There's a couple different reasons why, but here's a translation here from a guy named Farrar Fenton. I don't know the year when this was translated, but it's called the First Book of Moses. The First Book of Moses, called Genesis, translated directly from the Hebrew by Farrar Fenton. And this is Genesis 1:1. God created that which produced the solar system, then that which produced the earth. But the earth, But the earth was unrecognized and empty, and darkness covered its convulsed surface, while the breath of God rocked the surface of its water. And then he said, "Let there be light." Now, the convulsed surface means waves of mass strikes, meteors, I guess, stuff like that. So I think this translation is supporting possible evolution. Okay, and then I understand. I believe the Bible from cover to cover, but I understand there's hyperbolic statements and metaphors. Example of a metaphor is, "I am the bread of life. The day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. The Lord is my shepherd." And then some hyperbolic statements, Job 29:6. The rock poured me out of rivers of oil, which means he had an abundance of good things. The cities are great and walled up to heaven, means they're very high, and that's really all I have on that. And besides the beginning of Genesis for supporting 6 literal days of creation, go to Exodus 20:11, and this is in the King James. "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So that supports 6 literal days also. And what is this here? Genesis 2:7, "And the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." I don't see much support with evolution on that one. And then "By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the hosts of them the breath of his mouth." God spoke everything into existence. He just spoke, and there it was. So I'll just go through Genesis. We'll just go like the first day into the second day, and then I'll just give a brief description on my interpretation of what this means. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth, and it's important at the beginning here. It just says heaven. actually a lot of Bibles, a lot of new translations say heavens. It's not an extremely important factor, but later on down in Genesis, God divides up the heavens. He does the atmosphere and stuff like that, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. So in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Okay, so we have a lot of trinities here. In the beginning, that's God automatically. He's creating all this for us, right? Not for him. He's outside of time. He created time. So it's very beginning. He created time. God, that was the power, that was the source, the energy for creation. The heaven, that's space, and the earth, matter. So it all had to come in that order. Okay, and then the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. So that's what it means. It was without form. Later on in Genesis, he made the dry land appear. Grass growing, it's taking form, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. So he didn't create the light yet. God's light, but what kind of light is he? Gamma rays, ultraviolet. We don't know. So he's creating light for us. So and then the Spirit of God was upon the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." Now, verse 3 right here, I think, is where he energized everything. Now, how long it took, verse 1 to 3, is it, milliseconds, a few seconds? I have no idea, but right at verse 3 is where I believe that's where he entered, the light that we can see. And God said the light was good, and God divided the light from darkness, and that gets into our time, day and night. And so all this seems like literal days to me. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and morning were the first day. So in one day he did all that. Let's see here. And then God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the water." So that's the second heaven right there. That's our atmosphere where the birds fly, and that's where it correlates with, in the beginning he created just heaven, and now he's dividing it. Now second heaven, our atmosphere. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. So what does this verse indicate? And I'm not going to get into a lengthy discussion about it, but my belief here is this is the canopy theory, the ice canopy theory, and this is all pre-flood. What we see now is nothing like it was back in Genesis. So, and the supporting factor of this is if there was an ice canopy around Earth, and I don't know how high up it was, we'll just say 10 miles, that would compress the air, higher oxygen, and that would explain how things were so much larger in the past, with the dragonflies, 50-inch wingspans, gigantic clam fossils, stuff like that. So, and then verse 8, and God called the firmament heaven, and evening and morning the second day. So then we're into the second day. So we have, like I said, we have trinities here right at the beginning. Beginning is time, past. As soon as he starts time, it's past, present, and future. The heaven, which is height, width, depth, earth, solid, liquid, gas, and then we also have in the beginning God, and then we have the Spirit of God, and then we have God said, Trinity right there. So I'll just leave it to Aaron. You can explain your side of it.
Okay, so I wouldn't consider myself a young Earth creationist. I mean, I used to be. I see how it's a plausible reading of the text, and I don't want to say it's a completely illegitimate way to read the text, because clearly a lot of people find that persuasive, and on the surface of the text, obviously it makes sense to a degree. I don't think it's the only legitimate reading of it. I think there's indications in the text that might suggest a few other things, and the first thing I'll mention is it would be illegitimate as a hermeneutic to interpret literature, especially in this case to do what's called concordism, which is where we try to read modern science back into the text. We let our information about the world influence how we read the text. Rather, what we should do is focus on how the text was meant to the original audience it was written to and what the author would have meant by it. That's a more appropriate way to interpret the text in that sense. And so I won't be allowing our understanding of modern science to influence how I read the text, because that wouldn't be a legitimate hermeneutic. So I think we'd probably both agreed on that, and that's generally how you're to interpret Scripture. From there's a lot of different theories of what Genesis can mean. So there's the sort of literal theory, the 24-hour consecutive 6-day creation. There's one I heard called the gap theory, the day gap theory, where it's like the days are 24 hours but they're not consecutive. I've heard one where it's like the day age theory, which is the days don't represent 24 hours but certain ages of time. So there's a lot of theories. I don't really hold to any particular theory. There's another one, I think it's called mytho-history theory, which is it's not meant to be interpreted literally at all. I don't really hold to any single theory, so I'll just kind of throw that out there right now. I'm just not persuaded of young Earth. I'm pretty persuaded that there's reasons to believe it's not suggesting that this is a sort of scientific description of what occurred in history, but it's trying to signify something else. And I have a lot of reasons to believe that. I don't know if I'm going to lay the entire case in like every point, but I guess I'll go over just a few, and then I'm sure you'll have some responses or maybe some questions. One thing to mention is obviously it was written in Hebrew. It wasn't written in English, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Like when we translate things, we're trying to not only translate it into the vocabulary of English, we're trying to translate it into the just vernacular in general of how we speak of things. And that's an important thing to consider. And what I brought up in the last video is the first verse of Genesis, like the very first verse, is an independent clause. It's not a summary of the passage, and it's not a subordinate clause to the second verse. So for some context for those that maybe didn't watch the first video, the structure of Genesis is common in creation narratives, especially at the time it was written. There's a lot of pagan mythology that wrote their creation mythologies in a similar, not identical, but a similar structure, which is when circumstances were the case, the gods would do this. When this was the case, the gods would do this. And Genesis follows a similar structure to that. On the first day, God said, "Let there be," and it was so. It was this, and God said it was good. And then, so it follows a similar structure. And it's believed by at least all the scholars I've read that it was written this way on purpose to capture that audience. But it focused specifically on the fact that God is the creator of all things, and that the beings that God created were not gods themselves, as the pagans believed. The sun, the moon, the oceans, the stars. Our planets are named after Roman gods. So it's important to keep that in mind. But it's to indicate that these are created finite beings. They are part of our natural world, and then that there is a single God. Because obviously the Jews were pretty all about the fact that there is one Lord. And the first verse stands out above all of them, and it's saying that God created everything in the beginning. There's nothing eternal but God, and he created everything else. That's the point of the first verse. And I won't go into the full Hebrew there, but it's important to keep in mind the heaven and earth phrase is actually an idiom. They're not two independent things. It was an idiom expression in Hebrew for what we would call the universe, because they didn't have a word for universe in ancient Hebrew. So when the Hebrew would want to use, so to speak, a proxy of where we would use the word the universe or to describe everything, they would say the heavens and the earth. And when it comes down to translations of heaven or heavens, the idiom has no distinction. There's not a version of that where it would say heavens and earth and a version that says heaven and earth. The Hebrew's identical. And that's why every other translation but the King James in English has corrected that. But that's not, like you said, that's not a super important point. It doesn't really matter. The important thing to keep in mind is when it says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that's not like a summary of what you're about to read. And it's also not subordinate to verse 2 where it says, and then the earth was without form and void. So that's a point I want to keep really drive home is that when it says God created the heavens and the earth, and then the earth, it's not like continuing that thought. Rather, it's a completely independent clause, and then the focus dramatically narrows on verse 2. And what I mentioned last time is what that could open up for someone who really does want to take the passage literally. That gives a sort of grammatical option for the person that is taking it literally to not have to stick to the 6,000 year or so genealogy to Adam to creation. It could take you could interpret everything literally from there, all the genealogies to Adam at 6,000 years, but then it becomes ambiguous between verses 1 and 2. There's any amount of time that maybe it was milliseconds, maybe it was millions of years. It doesn't say in the text. All it does is give you the clauses. It's left open. So that's the first thing I want to get to. The second thing is the Hebrew word for day, yom, obviously doesn't have to mean 24 hours. Now, some responses I've heard is that anytime it follows an ordinal number like first, second, third, it always means 24 hours. But the first thing to point out is there's no grammatical rule in Hebrew that necessitates that. But even if you found maybe every example in the Old Testament, that's what I've heard. It's like every example in the Old Testament of an ordinal number with yom means 24 hours. And that's a plausible response. The thing is, since there's no grammatical rule that necessitates it in Hebrew, it could just be a sort of literary accident that that's the case. Maybe they just didn't use it in other ways. But let's grant that that's true, even though I think I have evidence that it's not true. Even if it's true, you can use a literal 24-hour day itself as a symbol for something else. And an example of this is the word arm. So even in English. So the word arm can mean a limb, like my arm, or it can mean a weapon. And the same is true in Hebrew. I'm not even sure Hebrew ever uses the word arm for weapon, but it obviously means limb, right? So when the Old Testament will refer to the arm of the Lord is with Israel, it means limb. It doesn't mean a weapon. The word means limb. But it's not to communicate that God literally has limbs. I mean, unless, like Mormons believe that, but that aside, unless you believe God has limbs, it's using the word arm referring to limb as a metaphor for something else, like his strength is with them, or they are in God's favor, or something like that. So the fact that it always means 24 hours itself doesn't mean that can't be used in another sense. And then finally, there's indications in the text that suggest it's not referring to a literal description of 24 hours. One is the fact that it uses and it was evening and it was morning the first day, and it was evening and it was morning the second day. The Jews obviously wouldn't have, if they really wanted, this is kind of my opinion, but if they really wanted to make us convince us this was 24 hours, they wouldn't have said it like that, because that's not how the day would have worked for them. They probably would have said evening and evening, or morning to evening. But that aside, the seventh day on that paradigm doesn't end. The seventh day doesn't have an evening to morning. And a lot of exegetes interpret that to mean that the seventh day for God's creation rest never ends, because he's no longer creating new things. He's not bringing things ex nihilo into existence. So that if the seventh day isn't 24 hours, because it doesn't end in 24 hours, then that opens up the fact that the others might not be as well. And then an example of this, I think it was in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. I think it reflects on the creation week. It says, and this is the account of the heavens and the earth in the day of the Lord. It was like the entire creation week is a single day. So there's other indications, but that's like a sort of starting level on why it might not necessarily mean a literal description of 24-hour consecutive days.
Okay. You mentioned day-age theory, right? Maybe each day might be 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, or
some people
years,
believe
like
that. Yeah.
So on day 3, God creates grass, herb yielding seeds, stuff like that, and then on day 4, he only makes the moon and the sun, right? And then just, of course, these plants depend on photosynthesis. So I don't know if they could survive in 1,000,000 or 1,000 years without any light.
Well,
without any sunlight.
That would be. I actually agree the day age theory is not very plausible. So like if you're reading it in a literalistic way, but just extrapolating the time longer, I think that obviously has some problems. But what your objection, even though I agree with you, I don't know how well it would work generally speaking, because that's no longer literally interpreting the passage, right? We're reading something into it, which is our knowledge of the natural world. Like they need sunlight to breathe, but if God said that's how He did it, that's kind of what a response would be. But I obviously don't find that very satisfying. But I think that's reasons to believe the text isn't trying to give a scientific account of what happened. I think rather it's trying to establish a pattern of the 6-day work week and the 7th day of Sabbath rest that the scripture reflects back on again, like in Exodus chapter 20, like you said. If I remember right, when it reflected on Genesis 1 back in verse 9, it said to keep the Sabbath day holy. In 6 days you shall labor all your work. The 7th day is the Sabbath for the Lord your God, or says something like that. So it's reflecting on that pattern for the work week of Israel. And I think that's kind of more of the rule. In fact, if I remember correctly as well, in Job, it talks about how there was the 6 calamities, and the 7th there will be no harm. In Deuteronomy, it refers to like the crop rotation, like 6 years you have planting and sowing, the 7th you let it sit, and then it even reflects back on like years, and it adds up to like 49 because of the 7, and then on the 50th one it's the Jubilee. So like it's the pattern I think it's trying to establish. Like that's my opinion. That's what at least that's what the totality of the texts reflecting as a whole in the Old Testament seem to be saying to me.
Okay. Well, you mentioned the one day, like when the day starts. Our next day starts at midnight, right? At midnight, it's going to be Friday. So in Genesis, it says morning. So I mean, it doesn't really matter. But you were saying it should have been evening to evening. I mean, ours is.
I'd say like
basically midnight to passages. Midnight is a day. So then the Hebrew translation, I'm not real versed on it, but doesn't it say in the beginning created God, and the word "thy's" not in there? Beginning, so heaven and earth.
The grammar's
so
different.
Do you have any, anything you want to say about that, or?
So if you were to translate word for word, just as it goes into an English word without accounting for grammar, the Hebrew would read beginning bara, beginning. No, I'm sorry. Barashit is beginning. Create bara, God Elohim, and then it says heavens and earth. The idiom. It's like one phrase. So it would just say beginning, create God, heavens and earth.
So where are you getting the time? When I say in the beginning God created heaven and earth was without form and void, is you considering that there's something happened at this point?
Oh, the text doesn't say. Yeah, the text doesn't say it either way.
Is that where you're getting the vast amounts of the billions of years?
Well, so here's the way I like when you ask me these questions of where do I see time here, or how does the sun work here, my answer is going to kind of be the same for all these, because I don't think it's trying to give a historical scientific account of what happened. I don't think that's the purpose of the text. I think the purpose of this text is to establish God as creator of the things, and it uses like everything it points out, I believe, is trying to emphasize the fact that these are created beings by God or the natural world, and I'll explain that in a second. And they're not gods themselves to be worshipped. I think that's the point, and it explains the natural world for man. And later, when it gets to Adam, it talks about how Adam and man has dominion, and he names all the animals, and it's a description of that, and it's to establish the patterns that is to be recognized by Israel. I think that's the purpose of the text. So there's not going to be like a point in there where I'm going to like, here's what I think's happening here, here's what I think, because I don't think it's trying to say that anywhere. So like, for example, I used to believe when I first came out of the young Earth age, I still tried to read it into the text. So I'm like, okay, well, so verse 1 must be the Big Bang, and verse 2 must be billions of years later after the Earth formed. I used to think that way. But now that's reading it into because it doesn't say that. It just says, in the beginning, God created heavens and the earth was without form and void. But what we do know is by the grammar, the first verse is independent. So that's all I can say. But the text doesn't say. As soon as we try to read it as saying this much time passed, we're not taking it literally anymore, because it just doesn't say that. So I think there's let me give you an example of the natural world, right? So when God says, God created heavens and the earth, when God said, let there be light, or God said, let there be, let this be the case, he separates the firmament from the water. He does all these things. He just speaks it into existence. But when he gets to the third day, I think, as you said, he doesn't say, let there be vegetation and fruit trees. He says, let the earth bring forth the vegetation and the fruit trees. And then it was so the earth brought forth these things, bearing seed after its kind, if I remember right. I haven't read it verbatim in a while. But I think that difference in grammar and language is relevant, because obviously they knew how long it took vegetation to grow. And unless you want to read it into the text again, which doesn't say, that they're kind of envisioning this as like a sort of time-lapse photography where it all just sprouts up instantly, which sure it could have happened, but that's not what the text says. We have to interpret it as it is originally understood, and I think we would be hard-pressed to read that back into these early Jews understanding it that way. They knew how long it took for an apple tree to grow and mature and produce apples, which definitely wasn't a short period of time. So that is an example of where I think the text is trying to indicate that the natural world itself is a created being by God and aren't gods, and is the other things that exist in the world are the products of the natural world. When he says, let the earth bring these things forth, that they aren't deities. So that's how I see the text. And then it establishes the pattern of the first, second, third, all the way through sixth, and seventh day, the Sabbath rest. I don't know if that answers your question. I kind of
it does, but what about the other verses that support 6 days of literal days of creation, just like with Exodus 20:11?
Yeah,
and
so
then with
it does reflect. You're right. It reflects back. So
and then with Jesus saying Adam was the beginning, Eve was the mother of all living.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course with God, man, he made man from the dust of the ground, breathed into, became a living soul. It seems to me it's an instant creation. It's not a vast amount of time. Now, say you never heard of evolution before. You don't even know what that word means, okay? And if you read Genesis 1 through 31, do you think at any point you would think of great amounts of time, or is it everybody has a different worldview, right?
Yeah, for sure. So,
and I used to be an evolutionist. I didn't really study it. I was kind of quiet about it. I didn't really want anybody to know.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to say earlier, I don't want people to think that it's evolution or science that's influencing my reading of this text, because Augustine didn't read it that way either, and he was way before Darwin, almost 2 centuries before Darwin, 2 millennia before Darwin. So it wasn't evolution like the way Genesis has been understood has been a vast variety for a long period of time, and it wasn't some touchstone of orthodoxy to read it as a young earth, right? So it's been a debate for as long as we've been here. Now people have tried to use evolution and cosmology and read it into the text and try to figure out where it fits, but I don't think that's the right way to do it, because I don't think that's what the text is trying to do.
Well, yeah, that's how far do you go with evolution? There's 5 other evolutions, right? We don't want to get into those now, but chemical evolution.
Yeah, I think that
stellar evolution.
I think those are completely different
evolution,
than the text. Yeah, that's completely
right. But
different.
I'm saying it's if you believe one, I guess you believe the rest of them too, right?
The way I also see is, if any way you try to see the text as being a description of what historically happened rather than it trying to be a narrative and establish patterns, any version you try to read it, you're going to run into some kind of problem, because that's not what the text. Like, that's trying to pull too much from the text. And examples of this is the Exodus verse you quoted. So Exodus 20:11 does reflect back on the fact that it was 6 days, like 6 literal days. But why does it reflect back on that? Well, if you go back 2 verses, it's because it's saying that this is how you should do your week. Your work week should be this way, as it was for God. So it's the pattern that's important there. And this is picked up again in Job and Deuteronomy, but it doesn't necessarily reflect back on the creation story as closely tied to as Exodus does, but the pattern is the same, the 6th and the 7th. And clearly the Jews got that from their understanding of, well, actually I shouldn't say that, because Job was written before Genesis was. So really this is the way Israel acted on it. And it could be the case, I'm not saying that the text says this, but it could be the case that the author of Genesis explained it this way for the sake of synthesizing the way they were doing their work week and other patterns. The pattern has a name. I'm trying to remember what it was called. It's like a type of poetry when you use this sort of numerical pattern. Like it was I almost have the word. It was like a chiasm. I can't remember the word, but it's like a type of pattern that you find other examples in the scripture, like for example, like Deuteronomy. But either way, I think the indications in the text that suggest it isn't merely a description of what's happening and is a literal event, because then you're forced to believe that God has nostrils and lungs and breathes. But I think it's pretty clear that that's not what that's trying to say. Not only is that not what that's trying to say, it's also, I don't think, trying to say that there is a literal breath of life into the dust of the earth. I think that whole thing, not just part of it, is meant to symbolize something greater, which is that man is in the image of God, which it does say. Unless you believe that.
Process of evolution.
No, it's not saying that at all. I didn't say that. The text just says that God breathed through his nostrils.
Well,
the life.
What's your thought on this? I don't see any problem with anybody believing in evolution and trying to fit it into the Bible. But what happens when you're teaching somebody about evolution and then they read the Bible? See, that's what happened with me. I was an evolutionist, and I didn't believe the Bible. As soon as I started reading it, it didn't make sense to me. So I needed to be convinced that the Earth is young. Well, 6,000 years is not young, but compared to 4.6 billion, of course it is. So after I got convinced of that, and then I started really getting into the Bible, then it all started making sense. It was supporting it. So that's why I changed my view, because the Bible caused me to change my view and the evidence of a young Earth. Because I thought the Earth was old too, and we evolved from primates, and I couldn't see any of that, from any Bible verses, or it didn't even make any sense that God would do it that way. He's already setting us. He's putting us in time. So we can't even comprehend 4.6 billion years or 13.277 billion years. So why would God make it so difficult to try to figure out his word? I would think he would try to write it as simple as possible and take it literally. And of course, the hyperbolic statements and metaphors, like if I would say, back in the day, that doesn't mean one day. That's 40 years ago or something, or back in my grandfather's day. That doesn't mean it's a day. But we can understand that. Now, Genesis, I don't see any metaphors here. I don't see any hyperbolic statements.
What about breathing through God's nostrils the life into Adam?
Well, it's just like creation, right? He spoke everything into existence.
Yeah. Does he have vocal cords and a mouth? And
well, I understand what you're trying to say there, but we don't know how he actually did anything, really.
Yes, I agree with that. I agree. We don't know.
But the time we do. I mean, in the beginning, he's creating the time for us. We can't comprehend billions of years, so right off the bat, if he creates this and we're gonna be taught that it's billions of years and all these gaps, 65 million years between us and the dinosaurs and stuff, we can't comprehend that. It's just way out of our time.
Yeah, I think I see the problem, and it stems from the idea that we have to read Genesis in a way that it's trying to describe what really occurred. Like it's that kind of literature, but it's very stylized. It's not like it's Chronicles. Like if you read Chronicles, the stylization is very straightforward in its timeline and history. There's no motifs. There's no indications of stylization and chiasms. There's none of that stuff. But Genesis is very different than Chronicles or Kings.
Okay. And then also these each days of creation, they also correlate with this 7,000 years of life on Earth. The 7,000 years counter. Just example, he created the lesser light and the greater light. That correlates to John the Baptist into Jesus. There's every day of creation. And I don't have them here. I have some slides, correlates with an event in the just like when God rested, he finished his work. Well, that's the end of the reigning with Christ, the 7,000th year, and then that's it.
Yeah, that could actually all be true, and then if anything, it could also support a non-literal description, because it could be about the patterns it's trying to forecast.
Right.
And it's using that to say, like, God's the creator, he created all the things I'm describing, and it's setting up a pattern to reflect on other things. But if you try to, I agree, if you try to read evolution in the text, it's not going to work. I think even if you try to read it as describing 6 consecutive days, creating the natural world we observe, that's not going to work either.
Okay.
So the thing is, you can't do either of those, and you have to read it more in light of its stylization of the patterns it's establishing, and the fact that these are created beings by God, meant for man. Because if you're going to be literal, then, like, at least minimally, you would have to believe God has nostrils. Like, you have to literally believe that God literally has nostrils. But, like, unless, I mean, but I think this is an argument the Mormon makes. I literally do. I think the Mormon's like, see, God has nostrils. He breathed. That's not a metaphor. He literally breathed air into Adam. So if we're gonna, as soon as we say that, that's not. I know, but is that a part of your apologetic there? Or would you say that God has nostrils? Like, that's a literal description?
When it comes to that, I can't explain that.
Well, I think we should use that same sentiment for the whole passage. Like,
well,
it's not meant to be explained.
But how much, you could see it's 6 literal days, and then you can add up. The Bible also supports, we talked about before, with the age dating from Adam to Abraham to Jesus to now, right? We're coming up with 6,000 years there also. So there's a lot of support for it being 6 literal days, 6,000 years of up to 7,000 years to the end of, basically. I don't know what's going to happen after 7,000 years, but I still can't fit in the vast amounts of time anywhere.
Well, if you try to, it's not going to work. Like, we shouldn't be trying to. I think that's kind of the gist I'm trying to get. We shouldn't be trying to fit it in, because any more than we should try to fit in the explanation of nostrils or of how.
Okay.
Like, and another thing, when it comes to the genealogies, there's obviously a lot of different responses to those, and I'm not going to have all that memorized. But I think the most important parts, given what I said before about how we're supposed to be reading the text, given the grammar and indications in it, is that you can have real historical persons used as characters in stories, and this is an example elsewhere. So it can be true that you drive genealogies back to David and back to Joseph and back to Joseph and Jacob and Abraham or Moses, all the way back to Adam, and these can be real people of history, but they can be used as characters in narrative stories for other purposes. So the text doesn't say one way or the other in its indication, but it was clearly done that way. So, for example, let's say Adam. Let's agree Adam is a real person, right? Adam had children who had children who had real people. So Adam's a real person. Does that necessitate, as described in the story in Genesis?
Do you think he was a real person?
I'm honestly open to it. I'm leaning toward yes, that there was a historical person that is described as Adam. But he
was placed in the Garden of Eden, or
so I obviously don't know the literal history of that.
Okay.
But I'm not saying that the text necessitates that that's what literally occurred, because I don't think the text is written that way. Rather, I think let's even like Noah and all them. I think the text can use, or rather, the author can use real historical figures in narrative-based stories that didn't have to literally happen. There's plenty of examples in all over Scripture and in other literature in general where this happens. But Adam could have been a real person connected to these genealogies and not be used literally in the story where we have to say this literally happened with this person. Rather, he can be using Adam as the figurehead that led toward, like, the Jewish nation, or led to Adam or Abraham, that led to the Jewish people for the Messiah. So I think that's obviously a really plausible reading. And then the genealogies can still be true. So what the genealogies would be saying, if what I'm saying is true, which it might not be, is that there's 6,000 or so years to the historical Adam. That doesn't necessitate, I mean, this could also be true, but it doesn't necessitate that it's 6,000 years to the beginning of creation. Like, those are two different things. Like, you have to add a premise there, and the premise is that the Adam described in Genesis is what really happened in that story, rather than using a real person in a story.
Okay.
So the text obviously doesn't say that either way, and I'm just sticking with what the text says. So,
Now, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
that was.
I thought you were. So how much of the Bible would you take literally? Because then it mentions Adam lived to 950 years old, or 930 years old. Noah lived to 950, and then these dates after the flood, dropped. All their specific ages given. How, if we evolved, we lived that long, and then now we're de-evolving, or like I can't connect it with are these ages real, or is it some kind of metaphor, or
so
I can't.
So here's where certain problems come in with all this. Obviously that all could be true. Like, I think that's a plausible reading of the text. There's a lot of work done on different theories and stuff on how that is to be interpreted, but this same sort of line of thinking is how the Seventh-day Adventist Church gets their 1844 investigative judgment. 1844 is an important year in sectarian traditions of Christianity. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but the Seventh-day Adventists find it pretty important. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I have
Jehovah's
a friend
Witnesses find it.
Yeah,
and it's based on the same sort of dating, based on ages and genealogies. And I think it's not that the text isn't saying those words. I think it's just that it's wrong-headed to read it in that light, when there's indications in the text that it's trying to represent the narrative more and the patterns established. And it gives the Jews a line to follow through the lineage up to the Messiah, or so they were trying to do anyway. And there's a lot of different examples, but without like digressing too hard on that, it's the chiasms that we're looking for, the sort of the poetic patterns established with these sort of numerical systems. And the only examples I'm familiar with off my head are the ones in Deuteronomy and Job. And I think Hosea 6:2, where it talks about they receive us for 2 days and they will raise up on the third day, talking about the deliverance. But it was over several years. And you want to look for indications that suggest it's not trying to describe it literally. Like, I think Adam names all the animals, right? And he falls asleep. And then when God gives Eve to Adam, he says, "At last, this is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." And that phrase is used a lot in Hebrew to represent a long period of time. At last. There was another example in a story of Jacob with the two wives, Leah and Rachel. He says, "At last," after I think like 14 years of working on trying to get them. So that's a common motif in Hebrew as well. So it's the indications that are in the text that suggest it's not trying to do that. Not so much things it didn't say. That's how I see it anyway.
It's interesting you mentioned rib. With the took out Adam's rib. That's the only bone that will regrow back if you break it off. One of your lower rib bones.
Yeah, and I've heard people talk about chromosomes, that the fact that men have a Y chromosome and women have X. Yeah. But that's also reading into the text again, right? The text does say the rib, but the chromosome example, which you didn't say that. I'm not saying you did.
No, but the next big event that happened was the flood, right? What's your take on that? I see evidence of a flood, a worldwide flood.
Well, we can't look at the outside world though to see the text.
But I'm saying is that you read into the text and it tells you about the flood. Mm-hmm.
Obviously the story of the flood is in the text. Yeah, so the story.
It says
Noah and the flood, it's all there.
It covered the highest mountain by 22 cubits or 15 cubits, something like that, 15 feet, which couldn't be a local flood, I guess, but. I down right down the road from us, next to where my Ark is, it's called a Data Retreat Center, and they're basically a Hindu religion. And they kind of, when you talk Bible with them, they kind of like to cherry pick it, and we believe this and this we're not sure about. And that's why I just took a literal view of the Bible. I believe it cover to cover, whether I like it or not.
Well,
because I think you can analyze anything to where you know you
I think
can't
it's
even
wrong to
come
cherry pick,
to a conclusion. It's if I keep reading verses and thinking what they mean, trying to come up with different meanings, it's am I going to get the right answer, or am I not?
Yeah, I
Never
agree.
going to
You
get the
shouldn't
right.
cherry pick for sure. And so when we say, well, we just don't believe these other parts, most of the people that discuss the Genesis creation story, they won't say that. Minimally they'll just say, I just don't think that's what it's saying. And so you kind of argue the text point. But there are people that will just say, no, a Genesis is no longer applicable, so we don't believe it. Yeah, that's cherry picking. That's not a good hermeneutic either. I think it's disingenuous to do. So I believe what the text teaches. I'm just not persuaded it teaches a literal description of history in that passage because of the reasons I gave. Like there's just indications in the text, like most of them being the fact that the seventh day doesn't end, that the earth produces the vegetation. God doesn't say, let it be that they exist, like he does with the rest of the creation. The fact that the amount of time implied by that and by the naming of the animals, by saying at last for Eve, the patterns established in other verses and other contexts of the same pattern, especially in Exodus when it reflects on the fact that that's where it gets the pattern. Like I think that's reason, Exodus 20:11, I think that's reason to believe that it's written for that purpose, for the pattern, not for the purpose of the historical account. And then the chiasm, the fact that chiasms are a thing where it's not literal, like numeral, like that the numeral pattern is what I'm trying to say. Like I'm not I'm not a scholar, so I know about those things. I think Hosea 6:2 is a good indication that.
I mean, there are stories in the Bible that are hard. Book of Jonas, it's kind of hard to decipher that.
I think Job
did he die,
also,
and did he actually die and God resurrected him? I don't know. I mean, the Bible's not a very it's not
a
easiest read in the world, of course, but I think what everybody's doing is, and I'll give an example, is it all boils down to your worldview, right? If you believe millions of years, then somehow you have to make the Bible make sense to fit millions of years.
Yes, that's
because I'm not saying everybody, but I have a friend. He's actually supposed to do a video, and we're going to talk about it. I'm actually going to see if we can get him on with us, which would be a good idea. But he insists that this is the truth, and this is what he thinks. He thinks that Jesus was actually from another, he was extraterrestrial, and he artificially inseminated Mary. He absolutely believes this stuff that we,
based on scripture?
I guess well, I don't know how. I haven't talked to him that much, but he says that he reads the Bible and this is how he translates it.
Yeah, I mean,
and then he goes to spaceships drawn on cave walls, and just like I would talk about an Allosaurus carved on a wall, and indicating that man saw dinosaurs, stuff like that. So that's what he believes. So he's going to try to fit that in.
Yep. That's
Bible verses.
Yeah, concordism is illegitimate.
And I guess it's a natural thing to do, because just before I was, quote unquote, a young Earth creationist, and I was an evolutionist, the Bible didn't make any sense to me. I could have went to church every day, and people could have been, trying to convince me that Genesis is true, and I couldn't fit the millions of years in until, like I said, I was convinced of the younger Earth.
Yeah,
and the evidence that I see that it is not billions of years old. So, but I mean we have to go through more of Genesis, get into the kinds and stuff like that. So
here's something I want to say that I think a lot of people, especially, well, I want to say a lot of people. Some people won't like what I'm about to say. I'm going to say something first that I think they will like. What we shouldn't do is try to change the meaning of the text to fit our belief of the natural world. That would be wrong, right? Like if I believe the world's millions of years old, I got to try to fit that somewhere in the text. That would be wrong. That's concordism.
It is, but at some point, that's what you might not be doing it to a specific verse or a specific part of Genesis or the beginning, but at some point it has to be.
Well, no,
it has to be in there.
These exegesis have been around for millennia. Justin Martyr, Origen. St. Augustine held, like, these have been around for a long way before modern science.
That's why they did the gap theory and the day-age theory. That's all.
Yeah,
right?
those
it's trying to increase time one way or the other.
I'm talking about the proofs I gave, or the reasons I gave. Those aren't new. Those have been around for millennia. But yeah, day age and trying to say, oh, there must have been exactly 3.8 billion years between verse 1 and 2, that's concordism.
Okay, right. But
so that would be illegitimate.
Just say like evolution. Okay, is the only evidence we really have of any kind of evolution is microevolution, which we call adaptation, right? Changes within a species. Everything still stays its kind. So,
well, that's not the text, though. So
we'll do a whole video. I know that. I was going to say something about that with text, but I can't remember. But
the main thing I'm trying to say right now is concordism would be illegitimate. We don't want to change the meaning of the text based on what we know about the world. That's an illegitimate hermeneutic. But what's equally illegitimate is to try to read our understanding of what the text means. So if, let's say, we establish it means 6-day creationism and stuff. Let's say that's the objectively correct interpretation. We somehow verify it. Everyone agrees. If we do that, it's just as illegitimate to try to figure out the world based on that. And a lot of people won't like that second half, because obviously the scripture is the word of God, authoritative, so it's our final authority. So I understand that, but what I mean when I say this is it's equally illegitimate as concordism. In fact, it's a sort of reverse concordism, because we're going to end up also being able to deceive ourselves into thinking that our interpretation is so abjectly correct that we're going to do bad science. And I've seen this a lot, where it's that presupposition that this has to mean this, so they're reading the scripture into the science. They're doing backward concordism. And we end up getting pretty poor science. And here's a good reason, here's a good proof, I guess, or a good piece of evidence why this is probably not the case. There's a good number of Christians that do concordism or other things, or that even if they don't do concordism, like myself, that believe in the sort of scientific theory of billions of years and in evolution and stuff. Like, there's a lot of Christians that believe that, right? But how many non-Christians that are scientists believe, based on the science evidence, in 6,000 year creationism? How many are there? Like, I don't think there's any of them, right? Like, none of them.
That's the thing.
It's an asymmetry.
Evolution is like people that study evolution. They're usually scientifically, with biology, pretty smart, but they don't know where to draw the line. I just give an example. Like, it's a fact that we can build spacecraft, right? It's a fact that we can build spacecraft that orbit the Earth. It's a fact that we can build spacecraft that can leave our planet, travel in space, land on another planet, and explore it. Therefore, Star Trek is true. That's where they go past the science, and there's no fine line, because, I don't think we want to get into evolution talk, but
yeah, the point of what I said is that the science billions of years thing. Let's just stick to the time scale. It's like, so billions of years versus 6,000 years. On the billions of years thing, you have Christians, Jews, and atheists. On the 6,000 years thing, you only have Christians and Jews.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So no person that doesn't use a text has ever derived 6,000 years from the natural world.
Now, if evolution was never brought up, I don't think many people would believe millions of years.
You're right. You're right. So before science, people didn't know how old the Earth was.
Why is Christianity dropping off now? Great falling away. Just churches are closing. Some are combining. It's going to spike. It's going to spike, but it's dropping off.
The 6,000 year belief. It's not like that was the belief for a long time until science came along. That's not what happened. It was just as contested today as it was then. It's just the people that were arguing against the sort of literal interpretation weren't also arguing for billions of years. They were just saying the text doesn't necessarily mean that. Now people are trying to do concordism, which I agree is wrong. You shouldn't say the text teaches billions of years. You'll never hear me say the text teaches billions of years, because it doesn't. The text doesn't say one way or the other, rather.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're retreating from a 6,000 year creationist view because of science, that's an illegitimate hermeneutic. You should establish what the text means on its own merits. So I completely agree. But the fact that people aren't believing that anymore isn't just a result of science. Now, for some people, it definitely is. But the point I was making is, to take the 6,000 year thing literally, it's not a coincidence that no non-Christian or Jew doesn't believe in 6,000 years, because that only comes from this genealogy text-based belief. It doesn't come from the natural world. There's no way to verify that. And that's indicative of trying to do reverse concordism, I believe.
Now, what bothers me is, like I said, it's not the fact that you believe millions of years or dinosaurs or 65 million years ago, but it's it's on my computer somewhere, but that college students say they go in, they study they're from a Christian family.
Yes.
Up to 75% of them lose their faith by
I agree.
So,
that's a problem.
And that's why is it because of evolution? I have a son that's 19, one is 17, one's in college. Okay, I asked him recently. They still teach that the Earth is 4.6 billion years. He said,
Yes.
"Well, of course they do. What else would they teach?" He didn't even. I've only been saying.
What do you think? What's the answer?
99% of my life I've been an evolutionist. I've only been a young Earth creationist for 3 years. So
yeah, it's
not
the
even
reverse
3 years,
concordism. So like, what else would they teach? Like, what scientist has been able to derive 6,000
right,
years?
and I understand in colleges they can teach creationism, but what happens if a teacher decides to do that? He's out the door,
what I mean is, like,
right?
what would they teach it based on? Would they be teaching it based on science? Or text?
That's where creation science comes in, and I understand it's not secular science. It's a worldview. It's how you view the world. And there's a lot of people that do look at the world and see that it's much younger. You can just as much explain an old Earth as you can a young Earth. Like, I believe there's just the same amount of evidence, or if not more, for a young Earth.
Well, we'll do a whole video on that one.
Yeah,
that's a good one, because that's not the text. But as far as the text goes, I was just drawing that dichotomy of like it's very one-sided on one of the.
That's just like
asymmetry.
When I read that what's his name for our Fenton translation of the Bible. I mean, what's your thought on that? That's
concordism. But here's what I think to answer. I agree what you said is a problem that a lot of people lose. Like, I think it's 80% actually lose their faith.
Yeah, I know it's high
because of science and philosophy. And here's why. It's not because they're not teaching creationism. I actually don't think that's the reason. I think it's because...
No, it's not because they're not teaching it, but it's what, it's... I don't know if I want to say a form of brainwashing, because myself, okay, I'm 6 years old. My mom takes me up to the library in 19... I'm 52 right now. Okay, so she takes me up to the library in 1972 or whatever, and I open up a book, and what's the first words in a book of dinosaurs? 65 million years ago. Instantly, it's bringing me back millions of years before I don't even know what that even means, right? I think it's kind of a form of brainwashing. For 12 years of school, evolution, millions of years, millions of years. Yeah. That's all you hear. That's all you know. And then you get in, you read the Bible, and God did all this in 6 days.
But it's like diagnosing where the problem is. So either the problem is that they're teaching that, or... because that's one possibility. Or what I think the problem is that Christians are teaching Young Earth Creationism. If you think that side, so if you don't teach your kids Young Earth Creationism and then they go to college, if you teach them more kind of a view I hold, just hypothetically, they're not going to lose their faith over the science because they're expecting that. Right. So it comes down to that.
Neither person, an evolutionist cannot prove millions of years, right? There's no observation.
Not through the text. I agree.
And a creationist cannot prove 6,000 years, but from the text we can, right? So then we look into creation science. What supports 6,000 years? I see it a fair amount. It does.
Like,
so
it's always gonna be a problem though. Like,
right? It will.
No,
I know. It will be a forever argument. But here's where I draw the line: is if you want someone to be in Christ, I don't think it's a good idea to go through Genesis 1:31 and then start mentioning, dinosaurs are 65 million years old. That's where I draw the line. If you believe it, fine. What are you teaching it for? What is it? What is the Earth being 4.6 billion years and the solar system being 13.277 billion years? what does that what does that mean?
Well,
Is that,
if you're
is that
asking what it
something
means
good,
for the
or
text, if you're asking what it means for the text,
no?
or
Well,
because like we do have to kind of separate those, because like you establish, okay, what does science say, what does the text say, how do you integrate them? So we don't want to do concordism or reverse concordism. We don't want to do either of those. We don't want to say that the natural world must be 6,000 years, so let's find evidence for it. Rather, you need to let the natural world tell you the way it is. You also want to do the same thing with the text. Don't let the world tell you what the text
and that's
says.
where I don't see that the world's telling us billions of years old.
I know, but that should be. I believe you, but
right.
I believe you believe that, but we don't want to believe that because of the text, right?
Okay.
You want that to be independent.
Well, that's why I take the text literal.
Yeah.
Right.
So
I'm not gonna look at it and try to decipher it in a different way.
Right.
I'm gonna read it straight from the text. To me, that's the word of God.
So
right.
I have a question.
It's what He's given me. His word.
Do you believe that? So we read the text. It says 6,000 years, and independently, the world. You look at the world, not letting the text influence your science, and it also happens to be 6,000 years.
Well, I mean, how much? How could you determine time? It's just like, for example, when I used to live down by Pittsburgh, there was a flood, and it completely demolished the whole neighborhood. Okay, 6 years after, you go back, and it looks like nothing ever happened. So, how much change is there in that amount of time? You can't distinguish time that way.
Yeah.
You can't say, well, that looks young or that looks old. You can't, but there's evidence of it. You go to the Bible with Noah's flood, like a worldwide flood had to and I know we don't want to get off into a tangent because that's what's going to happen, but so much evidence of things that are in the Bible. There's actual physical evidence, like the gravel everywhere, smooth gravel, worldwide flood with the tide going around and giant,
I think this is a good
giant washing machine.
This is a good segue into the science talk, which we should do
right,
next time.
Right.
We're hitting an hour
right now. But
that's
okay. Let's get into not tonight, but Genesis 1:9, and start there, and we'll go through whatever another 8 verses or something.
We can talk next time about the science, whether it suggests old or young, right? So that's
that'd be
focused on the text this
good.
time. So next time we'll talk about the science, because we want to separate those and then see how they work together.
That's fine.
All right. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, we went a little over, but we were shorter than last time, so that's good, right?
Okay. That sounds good. It's good talking to you.
Yeah, good talking to you.
We both love the Lord, right? We know that.
Yeah.
So that's all that really matters, in the long run. But all right, well, you have a good night,
right,
and we'll set up another time.